angel of the Lord. That's actually God himself who's appearing to human beings. But at the very least, this is an angel who's closely associated with God, not a bad guy, who's here to threaten Balaam, specifically to threaten Balaam by to kill Balaam. Have you ever wondered what Satan looks like? A red devil, pointy tail, horns, pitchfork, something like that. Now this is an artistic rendering, and you'll have to forgive me. I don't remember who actually did this this work. It's not Disney. It's not. And there are things that are wrong with this picture. For instance, and maybe we'll talk about this next week. Angels in the Bible are never said to have wings. I don't know if y'all were aware of that or not, but there's no passage in the Bible. Now you have cherubs who have wings and seraphs, and maybe we can talk about those another day. But no being that's called an angel that's said to have wings. So that's probably doesn't reflect what biblical authors are thinking. But in the sense, or to the extent that what you have here is just a figure that looks relatively human-like, who's carrying a sword. If you were to say the word Satan or Satan to an ancient Israelite, this is probably what would come to mind. Someone with a sword ready to attack someone else and perhaps kill that person. A couple of things that I think we can say based on this. This is really, in my mind, this is where Satan comes from. We haven't got to Satan yet, Satan capital S. We haven't got to the Satan yet. What we're going to see in our next portion of our time together is you have this title, the Satan, in the Old Testament. And so we're going to look at that in just a bit, but we haven't even got to that person yet. What we've seen is that Satan is just a regular word. It can refer to lots of different people, human beings, angelic beings. It wasn't necessarily a bad thing. It was someone who would harm someone else, someone who would attack and even kill or execute someone else. And it's in this culture, in this context, where people believe that there were such persons who were Satans. It's out of that context that we have the rise of a belief that there was one particular Satan who was kind of a permanent person, Satan. And we're going to talk about that next time. But let me put it this way. Before people believed that there was a particular person called Satan, they believed simply that other people could serve as Satans. And that even heavenly beings, not necessarily bad heavenly beings, could on occasion serve God in the capacity of a Satan, as an executioner of the wicked. Now, let me say that one more time, or slow down just a little bit. So before people believed that there was a figure called Satan, they believed that heavenly beings could be Satans, and that these Satans were simply figures who executed sinners on behalf of God. And these Satans weren't evil, or at least they weren't necessarily evil, at least not morally evil. They did bring harm, and so I suppose you could characterize their work as evil in that sense, but it wasn't morally evil. They weren't in rebellion against God. They actually, you can make a case that they served a good purpose in a just God's governance of humankind. If God is going to be just, that means the righteous need to be cared for, the wicked need to be punished. And there were angelic beings who could serve God as punishers of the wicked. Now, right now, you may be thinking of, what about like the angel of death or the destroyer in Exodus? Exodus talks about a destroyer. He doesn't call it the angel of death. I don't know if that's from Charlton Heston or where we get the angel of death. But you have a destroyer who works for God in Exodus. You have destroying angels mentioned elsewhere in the Bible. And that's kind of what Satans were. Those were Satans. In some cases, they're even called Satans. In this instance right here, that's one of them. My goal for our first part of our meeting was to present this, to get the background of what we're going to do, because in the next segment, we're going to talk about the Satan, where we get the idea of there being one particular figure who's called Satan. And then when did we begin to think of him as someone who is evil? But perhaps this is a good time to stop and Chris, maybe a good time to stop and take some questions. Yes, ma'am.
I hate to ask this, and you may not want to answer it, but have you ever been in a situation where your answer was, the devil made me do it?
Yeah, I wish I could blame the devil for that. Yeah. Okay, that's a really interesting question. It's funny the way you said that too. Was that who was the comedian who did that? Flip Wilson. Flip Wilson. Yeah, the devil made me do. Yeah, Flip Wilson. Yeah. So right now we don't have a devil who's making anyone do anything. Right. At this point, once we get to the book of Numbers, we have different angelic beings who are serving as Satan's. They're harming sinners. They're not causing trouble for righteous people. And they're certainly not making anyone behave in a way that's wicked. These are ideas that are going to develop over time, and these are going to be in the Bible. So if you think the Bible says that Satan leads people into sin, you're not incorrect. We just haven't gotten there yet if we're going through the Bible chronologically. And so we are going to get to that point. And one of the things we're going to talk about probably maybe next week, or at the very latest, the week after that, we're going to start talking about when did people begin to say that the devil made me do it. But we don't have that yet, because right now the devil's working for God, punishing sinners. Yes, ma'am.
Well, if what you said is true, what about the Garden of Eden?
That's a really good point. Great. I have a slide on that for the next section. Yeah, I guess I'll go ahead and give that away. Genesis 3 doesn't say that the serpent is Satan. Now, could it be that the serpent is somehow associated with Satan? And that's a conversation that we can have. But the author of Genesis there wasn't thinking of Satan. And so at some point, the devil does start making people do it, and then people would reread the Genesis 2 and 3 story in light of that, thinking, okay, if the devil makes people do bad things and the serpent made people do bad things, then what's the relationship between the two there? But when Genesis was written, they weren't quite thinking in those terms yet. You look skeptical, and that's absolutely fine. That's fine. Yeah. Some of this sounds really weird, right? Right. So you have 4 weeks to make up your mind. Now there is going to be a quiz at the end, but you don't have to make up your mind. You're just kind of say, oh, that's interesting. I don't know about that, and maybe you'll come to think differently by the end of our time, or maybe not. Yes.
I read where the idea of the seraphim and the cherubim, that one of them had the appearance of a serpent, the serpent-like, and that's where I kind of associated the serpent in Genesis with an angel.
Right. You have lots of, that's a very good, not many people know that, by the way. Like when I talk with students about that, most of them aren't aware that seraphs very likely looked like serpents. So you only have seraphs mentioned in one place in the Bible, and that's Isaiah chapter 6. And by seraphs, I mean these heavenly seraphs. But you do have the word seraph used elsewhere in the Bible to refer to serpents. And so yes, seraphs do look like serpents. There are several serpent traditions in the Bible. Some of them are negative and some of them are positive. So serpents are very dangerous. They're mentioned in several places as threats to human life. If you can imagine a time where we didn't have nice sealed off buildings with windows and doors that would keep serpents out, serpents could come into a house and easily kill a child. And so these were very dangerous. We have several passages in the Bible that talk about that. As a matter of fact, Isaiah says one day serpents are no longer going to be dangerous. But you also have, then you have the serpent in the garden who leads the first human couple to sin. You also have some positive imagery associated with serpents, like serpents associated with Moses. Yeah, the bronze serpent was healing, and this was a symbol associated with healing and medicine in different cultures in the ancient world. And that's why probably you've seen an ambulance or a hospital that has a serpent on a pole or something like that. You also have serpents associated with wisdom. So you get this in Genesis 3, where the serpent is more crafty than the other animals. But Jesus even tells his disciples to be as shrewd as serpents, but innocent as doves. So yeah, lots of serpent traditions. I don't connect the seraph with the serpent of Genesis 3. I think those are different sorts of things, but really interesting point. Yes, ma'am.
How is the Satan and the fallen angel? What's that connection?
Great question. I tell you what I'm gonna do is ask you to wait till next week. Next week, it's all about fallen angels next week. Yes, ma'am.
I was curious about Sumerian culture. Did they bump up against the Jewish culture? I mean, how come Satan just only the Jewish people? But
Sure.
the earlier cultures, they couldn't find any evidence of evil spirit.
Okay, what I'm going to try to do is review. It just occurred to me that we have folks who are zooming in, and they may not be able to hear some of your questions. So I'm going to try to repeat that if I can. So you're asking about contact between Sumerian culture and Israelite culture, and how Israel could have a conception of Satan, but not Sumerians.
I think of Hammurabi way back there with his development of laws, but nothing to do with sin. Well, it was for sin, but not Satan. So,
Right. Why don't we hold? I hate to keep doing this to you. Why don't we reserve that question for a little later? Because you have a unique situation. Well, I guess I can go ahead and answer that to some extent. You have a unique situation in Israel where it's really important to the biblical authors that they worship just one God. And so they can't have some of the different aspects of life being explained by different deities in their theology, the way that the other cultures and their theologies can do that. And so when you have one God, and it's important to you that there's just one God and that God is good, then you need to come up with someone else to account for why certain bad things happen. And so that may be part of the reason why you have Satan as a unique character in Israelite literature, and there's no one quite like him in other literature. Yes, sir.
And this may tie into the fact that you said yet a couple of times when you're talking about Old Testament, because in reference to the serpent not being mentioned as Satan in Genesis, but he has reference to that in Revelation where it says the serpent, the old serpent who is cast down, and it references him, the devil, the serpent. Yeah.
Great. Excellent point. So although in Genesis it doesn't say that the serpent is Satan,
Right.
In Revelation chapter 12 and then again chapter 20 or so, it refers to Satan as the ancient serpent. And so at some point along the way, Christians began to associate Satan with the serpent. And I think we'll talk about that probably our last week here.
Okay.
Dr. Stokes, just one question that's come in on Zoom I want to mention and see if you have a comment about this. Carol Rainey says, Satan as enforcer calls to mind the avenger of blood mentioned in Deuteronomy and the city of refuge. And he had just was curious if you care to comment about that, if there's a connection there.
Sure, thanks. So the question has to do with the possible relationship between Satan as a punishing figure and this avenger of blood that you have in what the passage was, Deuteronomy. So you have this legal practice in ancient Israel where if someone is murdered, that a close relative of that person seems to be authorized to exact justice. And so cities of refuge were created. I think we have these as well in the book of Joshua, where if someone is suspected of murder, that person can flee to one of these cities of refuge and receive asylum until they can actually conduct an investigation to figure out whether the person is guilty or not. But you have this avenger of blood who seems to be authorized to exact justice. And I guess it is, they're similar, that this a legal context, similar in that it involves execution, potentially. I don't know that the Satans that we have here, or at least the one we've encountered so far in Numbers, is necessarily a avenger of blood, like avenger of blood. He seems to be more someone who's working for, more like someone who's working for the king, rather than a relative of the person who's been murdered, but someone working for the king, more like a legal authority, someone more like a government official than a relative. But it is similar because they both involve justice and putting someone to death.
Well, it's about time we take a break. We need to give folks a chance to use the restroom or get another drink of water or something like that. It is 11:09 according to this tablet, so we'll take 10 minutes.
I hope that you're having half as much fun as I am. Your time is good. I enjoyed your questions. Questions are great. I'm glad that you're interested enough, and you have some Bible background too, to be asking these questions. And I got some questions between the breaks here, so it's really good to meet y'all, and come say hello if you haven't said hello yet. I'd love to shake your hand, and if you're shaking hands these days, bump this or whatever we're doing. Well, welcome back. So the second part of the lecture, the first part of the lecture, the title was, let's see here. Those are the points. I didn't pull those up. There we go. The first part was, what is a Satan, or what was a Satan? Now, this part 2 is, who was the Satan? Because we're going to begin as we move a little bit later. And when I say later, I mean, if we line all the Old Testament books up according to the dates at which they were written, we're going to move a little later. That's challenging to do. I don't know if you've ever read an Old Testament textbook and looked at all the debates about when these books were written. But were we to do that, what we're going to do now is move a little bit later to some of the later writings and see what these are beginning to say about Satan's, and in particular, one who's called the Satan. Now, let me go back just as a review. This is kind of where we left off. Prior to the belief in a particular person called Satan, ancient Israelites believed that heavenly beings might on occasion serve God in the capacity of Satan, an executioner of the wicked. Such a Satan was not considered morally evil, but fulfilled an important role in God's just governance of humankind. So that's where we left off. And now, move on to point 5. There are 2 passages in the Old Testament that mention a figure referred to as the Satan. So not the name Satan yet. Once we come to the New Testament, then we can start talking about whether we have someone whose name is Satan. But not the name Satan yet, but not simply a Satan either. Now we have someone who's called the Satan. By the way, this is not ambiguous. Like, this is not, although again, your translations may simply say Satan rather than the Satan. This is not ambiguous. I don't know if any of you have had Hebrew or not, and it looks like the font is a little different on this machine than it was on my machine. But here you have Ha-Satan, and this letter right there, that's the word the. Satan, the word the. Well, in Hebrew it's Ha, but it's the word the. And in 2 passages in the Old Testament, we have not simply Satan, but we have Ha-Satan, or the Satan. So what does that mean? If you have, let's say you have, I'll pick on Dr. Hummel here. If you have a president or you have the president, if you have a boss, or you have the boss, or you have a executioner, sorry, English teachers, and executioner, or you have the executioner. What do you think that implies? Yeah, there's an office now. It's not just someone who's serving in some capacity, but it's someone who's occupying a position, perhaps a standing position as God's executioner. The two passages, by the way, anyone want to guess what the earliest text is in the Old Testament that speaks of the Satan? Good guess. Good guess, although this is one of those that scholars would disagree about. So I should probably say I think it's the earliest passage. But it's actually the prophet Zechariah, writing around 520 BC, the way I read the text, at least. If you want to read a long, boring discussion about why I think Zechariah was written before Job, you can read it in the second chapter of my book. But well, okay. While we're here, y'all are like my students, but getting me off on these tangents. Sometimes you hear that Job is the oldest book in the Bible. Has anyone heard that Job's the oldest book? Okay, that's a pretty common thing. Has anyone ever seen the movie 10,000 BC? Okay, it's not that great. I'm not recommending the movie. It came out it's not accurate. It came out, what, about 20 years ago, 16, 17 years ago, 10,000 BC. The movie 10,000 BC was set in 10,000 BC. However, it was not released in 10,000 BC, right? And it's the same with the book of Job. The book of Job has a very early setting, maybe back in the early second millennium, around the time of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and that era. But it wasn't necessarily written at that time. And I think that sometimes when people say that the book of Job is one of the earliest books of the Bible, they're confusing the setting of the story with the actual date that the book was written. Does that make sense? So that's part of why I would date Zechariah before Job. But here's the Old Testament. There's Zechariah, and Job's the other one, right? All right. So in two books we have someone who's called the Satan. We'll start with Zechariah. We're going roughly in chronological order today. Zechariah chapter 3. The prophet Zechariah speaks of a figure called the Satan. That is the executioner. It's the way that I translate it. Who is in God's service. Now, does anyone remember Zechariah 3? It's probably not a passage you spend a lot of time with. If you have a children's Bible, it's probably not even in there. But that illustration is not from a children's Bible, just to clarify. I was really excited to find a Lego executioner, though. I didn't know that there was such a one. Zechariah 3. Then he showed me, this is the prophet Zechariah speaking, then he showed me the high priest Joshua standing before the angel of the Lord, and the Satan standing at his right hand to Satan him. Now there's a word we haven't seen yet. Satan, there's a verb that has the same letters as the noun Satan. And so it's just a verb that means to Satan someone, whatever that means. Now, if you look at your English translations, it probably says to accuse or something like that. Again, I don't think that's what the word means. I think that probably what you have here is the Satan standing at the right hand of the high priest Joshua to execute him. But I've tried to leave it neutral there. The Satan is standing there to Satan him. And the Lord said to the Satan, the Lord rebuke you, O Satan, the Lord who has chosen Jerusalem rebuke you. Is not this man a brand plucked from the fire? Now Joshua was wearing filthy clothes as he stood before the angel. The angel said to those who were standing before him, take off his filthy clothes. And to him he said, see, I've taken your guilt away from you, and I will clothe you with festal apparel. Then the angel of the Lord goes on to have one of the attendants put some nice, clean clothes on Joshua. But what you have in this passage is Joshua who's entered the presence of the angel of the Lord, perhaps the presence of God himself as a priest. And and he's wearing filthy clothes, which is not good as a priest. When you go before God, when you go into God's presence as a priest, you got to be dressed just right. There we go. This may be a little low for some of you to see. I'll read it to you. Exodus 28:35. Aaron shall wear the prescribed clothing when he ministers, and its sound shall be heard when he goes into the holy place before the Lord, and when he comes out, so that he may not die. If you come before God wearing the wrong thing, you may die. And the Satan is there. He's the one getting ready appropriately, at least in one sense, appropriately, getting ready to execute Joshua for having done this. This passage is also really similar to Isaiah chapter 6, which we mentioned just earlier. And that's probably a passage that's more familiar to some of you. That's the story where Isaiah sees in the temple, he sees God high and lifted up, seated on his throne, and the train of his robe fills the temple, and there are the seraphs that are flanking God. And Isaiah says, "Woe is me, I am undone, for I'm a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips." So Isaiah is worried because he's come into God's presence and seen God in an inappropriate state. Isaiah in an inappropriate state, not God, of course. And he's worried that he's going to die. Then God has one of the seraphs take a live coal from the altar, touch it to Isaiah's lips, which are what Isaiah is worried about. His lips are unclean. And then he says, "See, I've taken your guilt away." And then Isaiah is able to receive a commission as a prophet. It's really similar here. We have Joshua, who's come before God, or the angel of the Lord, and he doesn't have unclean lips. He has these filthy clothes. And then God has, or the angel of the Lord has some attendants take away Joshua's filthy clothes and clothe him with new ones. And he says, "See, I've taken your guilt away." The same wording that's used in Isaiah 6. So these are really similar visions of someone receiving a commission from God. Isaiah receiving a commission as a prophet, and Joshua being commissioned as a priest. It kind of makes sense that Isaiah's lips are burned. He's going to be a prophet. He needs his lips to be clean for that. And Joshua is going to be a priest, and so he needs priestly garments for that. But what you have here is you have the Satan. He's the one who's probably in charge of putting Joshua to death. The Satan. It's the, let's see if I can back it up here. Yeah, the Satan. The Satan standing at his right hand to Satan him, or to execute him, I would suggest. Is the Satan a bad guy here? Well, that's kind of a loaded question, right? But I guess if I want to be more careful in the way that I ask it, is the Satan functioning as a bad guy in this passage? And I don't think so. This is a story where you have a priest who's come before God in a manner that should bring about his death, according to Israelite theology. And the Satan is going to put the priest to death appropriately. Now, God rebukes the Satan. God has other plans for this priest, and he takes his guilt away. And that's a great, if you're looking for a sermon to preach on Sunday, there you go. This image of forgiveness that we get here, where Joshua is guilty and really deserves to die. And God doesn't defend Joshua, but God just takes his guilt away and then gives him a commission. But the Satan actually has a role to play here that in another situation would have been just fine, but God has other plans for Joshua. So here you have someone called the Satan, the executioner, someone who works for God, ready to execute someone whose actions warrants that sort of treatment, or warrant that sort of treatment, though God doesn't allow it to happen. Let's move along to Job now. Job is goodness. I feel like I should say a few words about Job. Job is such a great book for a variety of reasons, and even people with different faith commitments from our own, or no faith commitment at all, appreciate what is going on in the book of Job. For our purposes, what we have in Job is a story of someone who is righteous, someone who is innocent, and suffers incredibly severely, despite him not having done anything to bring that kind of suffering on himself. And one of the explanations given for Job's suffering in the book of Job is this figure of the Satan. Let's look at the story. Actually, Satan appears twice in the story, and we can look at just one of them because they're almost word for word identical. But this is chapter 1, verse 6. One day the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord, and the Satan also came among them. The Lord said to the Satan, "Where have you come from?" The Satan answered the Lord, "From going to and fro on the earth and walking up and down on it." I guess there are a couple of things to note here already. Satan is getting together with the other heavenly beings. Actually, the Hebrew here is sons of God. Satan seems to be one of the sons of God, so to speak, one of these heavenly beings who serve God. And he's gathering with these other heavenly beings to report to God on a particular occasion when these people are getting together. If you've ever wondered, why is Satan going before God in Job and not in hell or something like that? The reason is that in Israelite theology, or at least the theology tested in these books, Satan has a job to do. He actually is an employee of God in a certain sense. And here he is, as an employee should be, reporting to God. And God asks him where he's been, and he says, "I've been essentially patrolling the earth, walking up and down on it." My guess is that he's going around looking to see whether people are obeying God or not. And if they're not, then he's authorized to take some sort of action. The Lord said to the Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil." And God saying to Satan, what do you think about Job? He seems to be pretty good to me, not the kind of person that you would really need to deal with. Then the Satan answered the Lord, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a fence around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand now and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." So what Satan alleges here or suggests is that perhaps Job is only faithful to God because he's so well taken care of in return for his faithfulness. And Job's faithfulness, Job's piety is not disinterested. He's not committed to God just because he loves God for who he is and would be faithful to God no matter what. Job's faithfulness is contingent on the way God treats him, and Satan proposes a test. Let's see what happens if you, rather than waiting for Job to sin and then sending trouble his way, what if we go ahead and send some trouble his way and then see what he does? We'll see if he sins after that. Does the Satan here, does he have a valid point? Now, he's going to turn out to be wrong. Job is going to be, and I'm assuming that you know the story of the book of Job here. Job is going to be faithful. I'll try to stay put. Job is going to be faithful to God, even after he tests them, and then actually gives a more severe test after this one. And Job is going to remain faithful. So Satan is wrong, but he does make a good point. He raises the question of whether this person who's supposed to be really righteous, would be righteous under different circumstances. Then the Lord said to the Satan, and God seems to deem this suggestion valid enough to test. So the Lord said to Satan, "Very well, all that he has is in your power, only do not stretch out your hand against him." Now, why does God tell Satan not to stretch out his hand against Job? What is that? Okay, he hasn't proved anything yet. But to answer that in another way, if Satan is who I propose that he is, that he's someone who harms people, then God needs to clarify, okay, you can test him, but you can't attack him. Yeah, he's letting Satan loose on him, but he's not letting Satan do things that he might otherwise be doing.
But wouldn't the all-knowing God know what Job was saying?
Yes, I think you're right that God, according to Christian theology, God is omniscient and God would know all of this, but then you do have passages in the Bible where God interacts with humans in such a way that he, like in the Garden of Eden, he's walking through there and Adam and Eve are hiding from him. He says, "Where are you?" And so you have stories where God interacts with us as a human would, despite the doctrine of omniscience. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So God is allowing the test to move forward. Yeah.
You can't test it.
That's true. And that's why it says in the next one, Job actually passed the test. Satan goes, it's horrible, takes all of his property away, even kills all of his children. And Job remains faithful nonetheless. Satan goes back to God, and God asks a similar question, and they have the verbatim conversation again. Except this time, Satan says, well, we just need to apply a bit more pressure. In theory, I'm right, but you haven't let me attack his body. If you let me attack his body, then no one could withstand that sort. No one is going to be faithful to you if I give him these swords, or if I give one of these people these swords. And so he gives Job swords, and Job remains faithful again. That time, and this is I got myself confused. That time, God doesn't say don't touch him. He says don't kill him. You can strike his bone and his flesh, but do not kill him. And again, if Satan is the executioner, that needs to be clarified. Satan, this doesn't mean you can do your work as you might want to do it. You can't carry out the full authority that you might otherwise have. You're limited here. And the reason is, that you can't test someone's faithfulness if they're dead. Yeah. If Job dies, then you don't find out whether he's faithful or not. Let's see. Yes, ma'am.
So yes, God knows omniscience, but the story is so that it's written for our benefit, not because God didn't know what the outcome is.
Right. Yeah, I wouldn't read the story and say, see, God's not omniscient. That's not what I would do. But this is a story like some other stories in the Bible where God interacts with us in a way that's almost like humans would interact with each other. So yeah, I would not object to the doctrine of omniscience at all based on the story.
But it picked Job because he knew to pass the test.
Uh,
God picked Job.
Yeah, perhaps so.
because he knew he could pass the test.
Perhaps so. Perhaps so. What's really interesting is the next time, and I think that's the clue to what's going on in Job. The really important thing about the doctrine of Satan, or the Satan that we have in Job, is the second time that Satan comes before God, and God says, "Have you considered my servant Job? No one is like him. He is upright," and what's the language you use? Upright and blameless. He fears God and turns away from evil. Then God adds, "And he remained faithful to me, even though you incited me against him for no reason." And what Satan does in Job that he hasn't done in any other text that we've considered so far, whether the Satan or any other figure called Satan, is that the Satan here in Job attacks someone who's innocent. Joshua, the priest, and Zechariah, he went before God, or the angel of the Lord, wearing filthy clothes. And so the Satan wanted to execute him for good reason. The angel of the Lord who comes out as a Satan against Balaam, he does so because Balaam apparently is going to curse Israel. And so he has a good reason to do that. Abishai wanting to execute Shimei because he cursed David. That person has committed a crime. What you have in Job that you don't have in any of these other texts, however, is you have someone you have a Satan figure, not just a Satan figure, but the Satan who's wanting to cause trouble for someone who doesn't deserve it, for someone who is righteous. Now think about how significant that is. All of our beliefs about Satan, our popular beliefs, traditional Christian theology about Satan, assumes that he's not just going around working for God, punishing sinners. Maybe he's doing that, but he's also causing trouble for the righteous. The first time that we ever have that in the history of theology is in the book of Job, where Satan attacks a righteous person. That is so significant. There's someone out there in the universe who's working against the good guys, if we can call ourselves the good guys, if we're the righteous, right? But the people who are faithful to God, there's someone out there who, at least in some instances, maybe not in every instance, but at least in some instances, is trying to stir up trouble for the people who are faithful to God. And that all starts with this passage in Job. Yes, ma'am?
Is that an example of power corrupts?
That's a great question. I don't have a good explanation for it. Power corrupts. Why does Satan want to do this? And we don't know. There's no explanation given. Another question we could ask, is Satan at this point in rebellion against God? Or does the author of Job think of Satan as someone in rebellion against God? Or is Satan just someone who's kind of raising a good question? But you're kind of moving in that direction. And the history of ideas moving towards Satan being a troublemaker, not just someone who's doing his job. All right, how are we on? We have just a few. Let me mention just a couple more things briefly, and then we'll have some more time for questions. Number 8, the chronicler. This is a passage I've referred to before now. In 1 Chronicles, there's a passage that tells a story about David taking a census of Israel. And David's census seems to be ill-advised, if not downright rebellious. And as a result of the census, there's a plague that comes on Israel and takes 70,000 Israelite lives. Now, look at the difference between this story as it is in 2 Samuel and then this story in 1 Chronicles. In 2 Samuel 24:1 says, again, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, go count the people of Israel and Judah. 1 Chronicles 21. Satan, or a Satan, there's no the here, so this could be the name Satan, possibly. I think it's probably a Satan, stood up against Israel and incited David to count the people of Israel. So what's the difference? Does God incite David to take the census, or does Satan / a Satan incite David to take the census? Now, this is kind of an interpretive challenge, because one text says one and one text says the other. However, if what we've said so far, if what I've said so far to you is correct, then this difference actually makes a good bit of sense. If Satan is primarily thought of in ancient Israel as someone who works for God, punishing sinners, even if there's more to the story when we come to Job, but if his primary responsibility, as conceived by Old Testament authors, is to work for God as a punisher of sinners, then you can see how the chronicler would read this and say, oh, God is mad at Israel, and he incites David to take a census so that he could send judgment on Israel. Or the chronicler could just say that Satan did this. In other words, if Satan's working for God as a punisher, that makes sense. If Satan is a rebel against God, then it's a little more challenging to explain the difference here.
Or then if God's anger is embodied in a Satan.
Right, something like that. God's anger, yes. When God is anger at sin, the agent of the judgment that God sends is a Satan. Yes, ma'am.
Would it be too much of a stretch to say that the he in the Samuel passage is Satan?
In theory, it's not impossible. I don't, since Satan is not mentioned in that context, I would assume that here, I'm going to use my English grammar language. The antecedent of the pronoun here is either God or the anger of God, rather than, because Satan's not mentioned in that passage or even that book. I think so. But the chronicler, he sees that God did this, and the chronicler says, well, when God does this sort of thing, he does this by using this agent of punishment. And so the chronicler is simply explaining that. He's not changing 2 Samuel in a way. He's not the chronicler probably doesn't think that he's making a big change here. He probably just thinks he's explaining what's implicit. Yes.
So as we look at Job and how it worked with Job, and God letting Satan do something in order to prove the faithfulness of Job in that light. In the same sense, because God was already angry, he's also using the Satan to carry out the act to bring about the punishment as he has on other nations and other times as well. Am I saying that clear enough? Okay. So in the answer to your question, what came to my mind was it's both and, just in the sense that it is because he's God's Satan.
Yeah.
Therefore, it is God doing the punishing, but he's doing it through an avenue of the deception and the usefulness of Satan in that group.
Yes, yes. So if I'm understanding you correctly, I'm trying to be mindful of folks on Zoom. God is the one doing the punishing. Just like in Job, Satan is his agent to test Job or to punish sinners. So the chronicler seems to presume that this Satan is God's agent to carry out his judgment of Israel. And so to say God did it and to say that Satan did it, those two things aren't contradictory, because it would be like saying, President Biden did something that, in fact, one of his staff members did at being ordered by him to do that. So it's there's not really a difference there. It's okay to mention politics. Can I talk about?
At your own risk.
At my own risk. All right. Couple of other things. Just very quickly. We mentioned this already. Genesis does not say that the Satan tempted Adam and Eve in the garden. And I'm mentioning this now. We are going to talk about this later when we come our very last week here. We're going to talk about the New Testament and what the New Testament says about the relationship between the serpent of the Garden of Eden and Satan. So this conversation is not complete today. But I do want to explain why is it that Genesis doesn't connect the serpent with Satan. And the reason is, or at least part of the reason is, at this point in history, they're not thinking of Satan yet as a tempter. Satan is going around harming people physically. At least those Israelites who are speaking of a character called the Satan. He's harming people physically, harming sinners physically, as justice would dictate. In the case of Job, even harming a righteous person. But he's not described in these passages as really leading people to sin. Now, the Chronicles is a bit of an exception to that. I think there Satan, or whoever that Satan figure is, whether it's the Satan or a Satan, that person is leading David to take the census, but that's not really the object of his attack there. He's doing that because God's angry at Israel, and he's setting up a situation where God is going to judge Israel by sending a plague on them. He's not doing it because he has anything against David, or he's just interested in David sinning or anything like that. That's just a step in the process of judging Israel. So that's a little different from Satan being a tempter just for the sake of temptation, just because he wants humans to do evil. And Satan isn't thought of as someone who just wants humans to do evil yet. And so that's one of the reasons that Genesis isn't connecting the serpent with Satan. Yes, sir.
Job still had that free will to either remain faithful or not.
Yes. There's nothing in that story that suggests that Job did not have free will or anything like that. I think that's the point. Is he did have the ability to choose, and he chose to remain faithful to God. So Genesis 3, now the serpent was more crafty than any other wild animal that the Lord God had made, and he speaks to the woman. Then you do have Revelation. We've already kind of got ahead of ourselves, which is absolutely fine. Revelation does talk about Satan being an ancient serpent, whatever that expression means. But that'll be something that we'll talk about a little more in coming weeks. Lastly, the Old Testament is just the beginning of the story. Some of you right now, I'm guessing, if I were you and I were hearing some of this information for the first time, I would be thinking, yeah, but what about this or what about that? Or you haven't answered this question, Yeah, what about this New Testament text that I'm thinking of? This is just the beginning of the story. We're going chronologically, asking what were people saying about Satan in ancient times, and we're moving through the Bible chronologically. We'll even spend some time in the literature between the Bible. We'll talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls and some of the other writings of early Judaism that were written, roughly speaking, between the time of the Old Testament and the time of the New Testament. So this is just the beginning of the story. You have to, this is my attempt at leaving you in suspense. You have to come back if you want to hear the rest of the story. Paul Harvey did the rest of the story, right?
Right.
Okay. So if you want to hear the rest of the story. Okay. I think we have time. Oh, one other thing. Selfless or selfish. What's the word I'm looking for? This is a plug, you know, shameless, not selfless. This is selfish and shameless. This is my book. Actually, I don't know if you realize this or not, but authors don't get a lot of money for their books. So this is not about making money. What we get is we get to spread our ideas. And so that's kind of our reward. So I would love for you to read this if you're interested. But no pressure. I'm going to summarize it essentially in our time here. But this is the book. It's available on Amazon. I'll try to bring some copies if I can next week or so. But that's the book that most of this information that I'm giving you is based on, or you can find the fuller research there. Great. All right. Where is Dr. Shoemade? I think I have time for questions. Questions? Yes, sir.
Could you possibly go back to the numbers slide, verses 8 through 11?
Sure. Oh, numbers, like for the first half of our time.
No.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Right there?
This one?
No, the one previous. There. Jody?
Yes.
I'm asking myself as I read these verses, I'm putting the word Lucifer where you have these.
Sure.
And I'm questioning myself, has the fallen begun yet? So is he talking to, if it hasn't begun, he could say, then Lucifer answered the Lord in this conversation, but he's not using the name Lucifer. Yet many scholars claim that Lucifer is Satan. Fallen Lucifer is Satan.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just like to hear a comment from you on those thoughts.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. As a matter of fact, let's see here. Look at this. Isaiah 14. This is a passage from which we get the name Lucifer. Interestingly, the name Lucifer is not in the Bible, or at least not in the Hebrew Bible or in the New Testament. The passage where this is found is in Isaiah chapter 14, where it refers to a shining morning star. Actually, here's what it says: shining morning star. How you have the Hebrew here is Hallel ben Shachar, like shiny one, son of the dawn. How you've fallen from the heavens, you destroyer of nations, you have been cut down to the ground. You said to yourself, get on here so I can face you. I will ascend to the heavens. I will set up my throne above the stars of God. I will sit on the mount of the God's assembly in the remotest part of the north. I will ascend above the highest cloud. I will make myself like the Most High, but you will be brought down to Sheol, into the deepest regions of the pit. And this is a passage that traditionally has been interpreted to refer to the fall of Satan. And let's see what this next one does. I think a couple of things here. Let's see if I can. There we go. The shining morning star, that is translated by Jerome in the Vulgate as Lucifer, which means like light bearer. So it's really just a translation of the Hebrew there. He's comparing the fall of the king of Babylon to like a star that's fallen from heaven. And the Vulgate is translated into Lucifer. Later, interpreters began to read that as though that's the name Lucifer. But that's not a name in the Vulgate, and it's not a word that even occurs in the Old Testament. It's just a Latin translation of shining morning star. And the passage is actually not even about Satan, for that matter. If you go back to verse 4, what it says is that the passage is about the king of Babylon. and it compares the king of Babylon to a fallen star. Yes, sir.
I've really liked the way you talked about everything, so big compliment, thanks. The fact that it's all written down material that you're working with, and the tradition probably predates written material. Can you comment on something like that?
Sure, yeah, and really, really insightful question there. What we have in our written texts are just a small number of the actual texts that would have been written in the ancient world. So there would have been many, many more texts written at that time that we do not have, more texts that have been lost than we do have. Now, I'm not saying there are missing books to the Bible, but as we're looking at the historical evidence of for ideas, there are lots of texts that we simply don't have access to. And then I don't know your name, but you raised an even like a bigger question. What about things that weren't even written down? These written texts are evidence or reflections of traditions that would have been in people's minds and would have been spoken. And so what we have here is only a fraction of the actual information that we have to work with. Yeah.
What I'm saying is you're kind of doing an archaeology almost
Okay.
of when these ideas come into written form.
Yes.
Is that right?
I think so. I kind of going through layers like you would with an archaeological tell, where kind of the earlier layer, the lower layers, the deeper you go, the earlier in history you go. And so I'm kind of going sequentially, chronologically through these different layers of the Old Testament, different texts. So I suppose so. Okay, good. I saw this hand back over here first. I'm sorry. You people in the middle get my attention more so than people, but I'll try to come back to you. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Stokes. So as I'm listening to you talking about kind of the ancient Jewish understanding of God, that's where you are today with us. I'm wondering if this concept of the Satan as the executioner doing God's bidding comes out of the forming of the identity as like monotheists.
Mm-hmm.
Is that where this is coming from in opposition to the culture around them?
I think that's part of it. So the development of this idea of Satan, how does this relate to Israelite monotheism? And I think it does, because if you just have one God, then that one God needs to explain everything. You can't have multiple gods. One God that explains this part of my life, another God that explains this part of my life. They just have one God. And so everything I experience has to somehow be traceable to that one God. But some of the things that I experience or that my friends experience are not positive. And so how do I trace even the negative aspects of life back to that one God? And that's some of the impetus, I think, for the direction that this doctrine of Satan, this tradition of Satan goes, because they need to account for these aspects of existence, but they also want to make it clear that God is not responsible for all of this. And so we're starting to get there with Job, in that it's okay if you have one God and he's punishing sinners, but when you have one God who's good and bad things are happening to good people, at that point you need to come up with some other explanation for it, and Satan makes sense. Yeah. Yes, sir.
When David was bringing back the ark and the guy tried to steady it, he was executed. Is this in the same line as the executioner Satan, or something different?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I can't remember that guy's name. The guy who took the ark, the ark is on a cart and one of the oxen stumbles and it's going to stumble. And there's a man who reaches out his hands to steady the ark, and he dies. I think that they're similar, that you have someone who's being put to death as an act of God. And perhaps the ancient Israelites, or some of them, would have thought that maybe there was a Satan involved there, or an executing angel who's involved invisibly, but it doesn't say. Yeah. Yes.
I was wondering, the shining morning star, would that refer to the Sumerian, Ashtar? Ashtar was the god, and then you see it depicted as a star. About Babylon.
Right.
Ashtar.
Yeah, and it's been a while since I've read the commentaries on this, but I know that there are scholars who've suggested different, perhaps particular stars or constellations that are involved, and even particular myths, like from other cultures of deities. And I can't remember if Ishtar is one of them or that perhaps so. But it may be that he's referring to a story about like a fallen deity or something like that, such as we find in one of the other traditions. Yes.
Like you triggered a thought about Cain and Abel's story, where God says sin is crouching at your door.
Uh-huh.
You know, can you comment on that in relationship to the executioner?
Yeah, I was just talking about this 2 days ago with my one of my Old Testament classes. Not with relation to executioner. We were talking about when Adam and Eve, when they've sinned, and God is listing the consequences for this, and he tells the woman, she's not named Eve quite yet in the story, but he tells the woman that your desire will be for your husband, but he will rule over you. And translators, and you can imagine all of the social implications for what's going on there. And in the Hebrew, it's not as clear as we would like for it to be. But what I tell students is that this perfect companionship that God gave the first human couple, making a woman from the rib, that's messed up now. And the way I make that point is that the same language about your desire will be for your husband, but he will rule over you. That's the very same language that's used in the next chapter of the relationship between sin and Cain. How sin's desire is for Cain, but Cain must rule over it or something like that. Now, I'm not saying that therefore women are sin and men are Cain. I mean, but it's messed up, okay? Something has gone really, really wrong with the world. But yeah, something's going on there. What does that mean? That sin is crouching and its desires for you, but you must rule over it. And it almost does personify sin, doesn't it? It doesn't mention Satan. You know, Satan would have been, just the Hebrew word Satan would have been someone who's attacking and harming people. But you do, just because Satan's not trying to cause someone to sin in their thought doesn't mean that they're not thinking of sin as something that's out to get us. Something that's separate from, not just internal to us, but something that can act on us as well.
Thank you, Dr. Stokes.
I'm sorry to have to cut the party short, but